Brooks.
Good morning, everybody. We're gonna listen to the Senate now. They are going to they are working on confirming Tulsi this morning. Supposedly they're gonna talk until 11, and after that they want to confirm her at 11. That's what is saying. The schedule is saying. So we're gonna listen to this, and hopefully she's gonna be confirmed this morning. Donc là, on va regarder ça parce que ça a l'air que Tulsi, ils vont parler de Tulsi là, jusqu'à 11h. Puis à 11h, ils vont faire le vote. On veut savoir le vote, nous autres. C'est vraiment important, là. Plus vite que ça, elle va être nominée, le plus vite que ça va bouger les affaires. Que je sais pas qu'est-ce qu'ils font, là. Ça, c'est le Senate floor. That's the Senate floor. I'm not sure exactly what they're doing. Right. So we're gonna listen to this. And hopefully at 11 they're gonna do the vote. And she's gonna be confirmed, so we can move on with that. Fait que là, il y a du monde qui va parler, ça a l'air, jusqu'à 11h. Parce qu'à 11h, c'est le vote. Il n'y a pas l'air d'avoir grand monde, hein. Et je sais pas, là. Je sais que Chuck, il vient de venir parler. Ça me faisait bonjour à tout le monde. Fait qu'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui va parler. On va écouter. Puis on va voir comment ces affaires-là vont développer. C'est vraiment, vraiment important qu'elle soit confirmée. Ça va être la directrice du DNI, c'est le Director of National Intelligence. C'est elle qui va être en charge de toutes les affaires. Il y a aussi un hearing de Dodge. Je vois ça là, sur l'autre écran. Ok, ça me laisse pas le temps là, pour ça là. So, we're waiting. See what it seems that I'm looking at the other screen. The first Dodge committee hearing on government spending. It's fucking cold this morning too. Il fait moins 30 à matin là, ça c'est pas cool. En plus. J'avais des choses à faire, mais là il fait trop froid. On attend de voir qui va parler. Quelqu'un qui va parler à un moment donné. Ou ils vont être de même jusqu'à 11h, je sais pas. On va regarder. En passant, j'ai pas vu la conférence de presse de Anna Paulina, là, Luna, là, faut vous regarder ça, là. Vraiment, vraiment, vraiment important. If you have not seen the press conference of Anna Paulina, Luna, it's very, very important. They're gonna declassify all sort of papers. Very, very interesting. Hey. Angel, I have on the other screen the hearing of Dodge. Maybe that's why there's nobody there. So it seems that it's gonna be. Okay, ça m'arrête là. Let me check here. Sam, sit down. I said, convene and proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the nomination of Tulsi. And that's it. And it's quite puzzling. That we're gonna have people talking. Well, let it run. Oh, there's nobody. So I'm not exactly sure. Oh, look. This guy is putting something there. I mean, somebody's gonna come and talk. Qu'est-ce que ça me lâche, moi, là? Bon, il y a quelqu'un qui va venir parler, certain, là. Il a mis une table là, il y a une table là, il y a une table là. Il y en a trois. Very puzzling. Regarde ce qu'ils disent. Non, on est correct. Pendant qu'on attend ça, je vais aller chercher la Dutch Conference ici, là. Peut-être écouter ça en même temps. Tant qu'à voir rien, on va trouver quelque chose à écouter. Non, on va switcher pour quelque chose d'autre. It's talking about hostage. On va écouter ce qu'ils disent.
On social media, but we're not here to play. If you have serious desire to engage in democracy and transparency, we welcome you to the Oversight Committee. Come and testify in front of the American people under oath, because we want to know what you're up to. So if you're interested in talking to us, then please join us here in the People's House in the House of Representatives. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. President Trump signed an executive order on his first day in office called Establishing and Implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency. The EO simply renamed an office in the White House that was actually established by President Obama in 2014.
I don't know here about Obama. Oh, there's somebody coming. I don't want to hear. Well, somebody will come and talk now. Here, there's a guy here who's going to talk. Let's listen. Okay, let's listen.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are.
I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, President Trump's border czar was at the Capitol yesterday to update Republican senators on the progress the administration's making on arresting and deporting criminals here illegally. And it's difficult to believe some of the individuals they've arrested were still in the country. Members of violent international gangs, individuals arrested for murder, for rape, for kidnapping, for drug trafficking, for sexual crimes involving children, and for human smuggling. Again, it is staggering to think that these criminals were out there on our nation's streets, and our communities will be safer places without these individuals. Mr. President, since day one of his administration, President Trump has been fulfilling his campaign promise to crack down on illegal immigration and secure our border. And it's good to see. Immigration is a key part of our country's story, and immigrants have made untold contributions to our country. But we need to ensure that immigration is done legally for both the safety of our country and to preserve respect for the rule of law. The chaos of the last 4 years was unsustainable, and it was dangerous. We had 10 million individuals flood across our southern border. We had millions of undocumented individuals take up residence in our country, more than the population of a number of U.S. states. Law enforcement officials were overwhelmed, and officers were pulled off of the essential work of guarding the border just to process the flood of migrants. Border cities and other cities across the United States struggle to deal with the influx. And all of this chaos was an invitation to terrorists, to smugglers, to drug cartels, and other dangerous individuals to enter our country. And so I'm tremendously proud and grateful for the incredible amount of work the President has done so far to make it clear that illegal migration will no longer be tolerated. But Mr. President, there's a lot more work to do. And some of that's going to require Congress's help. Mr. Holman, President Trump's border czar, made clear to senators yesterday that Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement are going to need additional resources to continue the good work they've been doing to secure our border and to get criminals off of our streets. And we intend to deliver. Today, Senator Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, is kicking off the committee markup of a budget resolution that will lay the foundation for a transformational investment in border security and immigration enforcement and in our national defense. We will provide resources to increase the number of immigration and customs enforcement officers and Border Patrol agents, expand detention space, facilitate deportations of dangerous individuals, and obtain the barriers and technology that we need to secure the border. Mr. President, for too long, our country has tolerated rampant illegal immigration. That ends now. I'm grateful for everything the President is doing to protect our streets and uphold the law, and the Republican-led Congress will ensure that the administration has the resources needed to continue this important work. Mr. President, in a few minutes, we're going to be voting on a couple of nominees. The first one is Tulsi Gabbard to be the director of the DNI. The second one will be a cloture vote to proceed to the nomination of Bobby Kennedy to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, what I observe that's interesting about both of these nominees is that both are former Democrats. In fact, a year ago, they were Democrats. I would argue they've seen the light, they've become Republicans, and now they've been nominated by President Trump to fill important posts within his administration. But I make that observation only because there's a lot of talk these days about loyalty oaths and allegiance and saliva purity tests for people to be considered, good enough to be in the so-called MAGA movement, in other words, the Republican Party. And yet, when it comes to Democrats, a very different standard seems to be being applied here. Because both of these people were former Democrats. In fact, frankly, they probably agree with the Democrat Party here in the Senate on a lot of the positions that they hold. And yet, they had the temerity to come out and support positions that perhaps ran contrary to some of the positions held by particularly the progressive wing of the Democrat Party in this country. In the case of RFK, coming out for some positions that run counter to the orthodoxy of the healthcare so-called establishment. Or in the case of Ms. Gabbard, different views perhaps about national security matters than those held by a lot of Democrats, certainly here in this chamber and in the progressive movement in the country. And it harkens back to two other Democrats who pretty much got pushed out of their party here in the United States Senate for holding views that ran contrary to the majority view of the progressive wing of the Democrat Party. Those two Democrats were Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. In the case of Kyrsten Sinema, she was viewed, I think, by Democrats as perhaps too free market. She was viewed as pro-business, as pro-investment, and as pro-jobs, lighter regulatory touch, lighter tax policy, pro-energy policy. In the case of Joe Manchin, he had he had what I would say are accurate views with respect to energy development in this country. In other words, making America energy dominant, a view shared by many in our party, including our president. And for that, he was viewed as too conservative to be a true Democrat. And so Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema ended up getting pushed out of the Democrat Party here in the United States Senate. Now, their ultimate cardinal sin, however, in the case of Manchin, as I said, he was pro-energy in a party that is dominated by climate, green, all those, however adjectives you want to use to characterize or describe it. His views ran contrary. In fact, he tried to cut a deal with the Democrats in the Inflation Reduction Act, only to find out that they kind of went back on him, and the deal wasn't what he thought he had agreed to. So his views were out of the mainstream of the Democrat Party, as were Kyrsten Sinema's. But their cardinal sin, Mr. President, their cardinal sin was that they voted against getting rid of the legislative filibuster, a view that was held by, up until just a few years ago, a majority of Democrats here in the United States Senate. There was a letter signed, which I shared the other night, had 32 Democrat signatures on it, pleading with the leadership here in the Senate not to abandon the Senate tradition and heritage with respect to the filibuster, to maintain the heritage and the tradition that the Senate has for open debate and for representation of the minority, for the requirement for collaboration and bipartisanship when it comes to moving consequential legislation. Those are the things that the filibuster traditionally was about. And up until a few years ago, most of my colleagues on the other side, a majority on the other side, signed a letter articulating their views that ought to be the position of the United States Senate. Well, they tried to push it because they weren't getting the outcomes they wanted on a couple of pieces of legislation when they had the majority a couple of years ago, and they forced a vote on changing the rules, breaking the rules, to get rid of the legislative filibuster and be able to enact an agenda that's more consistent with their liking. There were two people that voted against it on their side, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And for that cardinal sin, they were essentially ostracized. And to this day, Mr. President, the Democrat Party continues to hold a position now, very contrary to the one they held just a few years ago, about getting rid of the legislative filibuster. And why do they want to do that? Because they want to enact an agenda, a progressive leftist agenda, which the American people voted against in November. And as recently as last summer at the Democrat convention, the Democrat leader basically laid out the things they want to do. First, he said, we're going to get rid of the filibuster because we have the votes now. Manchin and Sinema are gone. I've talked to the Democrats that we think we're going to elect, and we're going to have 51. And at that time, he was predicting a clean sweep. They were going to win the House, the Senate, and the White House. And they would get rid of the legislative filibuster, and the first thing they would do is they'd federalize our elections in this country. That was the first thing they were going to do. And then they said they were going to enshrine abortion rights in law. That was one of the things they were going to do. There have been many on their side who have talked about packing the Supreme Court, about allowing statehood for Puerto Rico and for Washington, D.C., all elements of the agenda that they want to accomplish through getting rid of the legislative filibuster. That was articulated by the Democrat leader as recently as the Democrat convention last summer. Intentions that they had to get rid of the legislative filibuster so that so that their party is in control, that they could do the things that they wanted to do, that they felt that the American people were asking them to do. Well, it turns out there was an election between last summer and now in which the American people spoke otherwise. And they had a very different view than the Democrats on a whole range of issues. Issues on which I think the left and the Democrat Party is completely out of step with the American people. Not the least of which is allowing boys to play girls' sports. That's a 90% issue with the American people. The House has passed legislation on it. We will vote on it at some point in the future. And I just can't imagine, and I speak as a dad of daughters who were both female athletes, one of whom is in her high school and college Hall of Fame. I don't know how anybody, and this is where I say, I think that there's just a certain intuitive common sense the American people have. And they voted for that and made that abundantly clear in the election this last fall. And so I say that, again, just to remind people when you hear this perspective about how Republicans don't have any room for dissent. They all got to be in lockstep. Believe me, we got a lot of dissent on our side. Try leading the Republican conference. The Democrats, on the other hand, you have a dissenting view, particularly on something like the filibuster. Sorry, you're out of here. And so, Mr. President, today, it's ironic to me that we are going to vote on two nominees, President Trump's nominees, to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services and to be the Director of National Intelligence, who are former Democrats. And I will be surprised. I would like to be surprised. But I don't believe that there's going to be a single Democrat that votes for either of the two people who less than a year ago were members of their party. In some cases, members of their party that goes back decades. The Kennedy family, Democrat politics in America. So you have two nominees who were Democrats a year ago, but because they articulate views now or demonstrated dissent from the ideology of the Democrat Party are no longer can get even one Democrat to vote for him here on the floor of the United States Senate. Now again, I'm hoping to be surprised. That vote's going to happen in about 30 minutes on Tulsi Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence. And then shortly after that, we'll have a cloture vote on Robert F. Kennedy to be Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. In each of those cases, you got Democrats in good standing, as recently as a year ago, who have been pushed out, come now, they're nominees by President Trump for positions within his administration, and you're not going to see a single Democrat vote for them. But we will confirm them, and we'll get these people into these positions as soon as possible. And answer, I think, the mandate that was given by the American people in November, and that is they want a different track in this country, a different direction. They have a different set of priorities than is being articulated here on the United States Senate. Mr. President, we also had just recently a vote on Laken Riley, and that was probably the most glaring example, again, of Democrats' willingness to filibuster, something they wanted to get rid of 2 years ago. They want to get rid of the legislative filibuster. We get the majority. First time we put a bill on the floor, what do? They filibuster it. And so here we are, slowing down these noms, full 30 hours on Tulsi Gabbard. I assume they'll do the same thing on RFK. But these are people that are going to be confirmed and going to be again working in this administration to implement the agenda that the President of the United States has articulated and the one that he carried to the voters in this last election, in an election in which the voters gave him a decisive majority at the polls. And so, Mr. President, I hope, again, that I'm wrong. I hope that we have a bipartisan vote today on either or both of these nominees. But I will tell you that based on my assessment of where the party is, the Democrat Party in this country, it will come as a great surprise to me if that's the case. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Democrat leader.
Mr. President, let me begin with a quote from President Trump during his campaign for the presidency. He said, "When I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one." Well, today is day 23, and prices are up 3%. Let me reiterate. Donald Trump said during his campaign prices would come down starting on day one. It's day 23, and prices are up 3%. Donald Trump is already breaking his promise to the American people. Inflation is the #1 concern of most Americans. And Donald Trump said he'd fight inflation, but he hasn't. Groceries are up up 0.5%. Chicken, pork, steak are all more expensive. Egg prices are up 15% from last month. Gas prices are up 2% from last month. The price of used cars are up. The price of heating your home is up. Housing costs are through the roof, even though Republicans are racing to privatize Fannie and Freddie. Well, welcome to the age of Trumpflation. Donald Trump is breaking his promise to lower costs. This was the #1 issue in the campaign to most people. And Donald Trump said, starting on day one, prices are going to start coming down. Well, they're up 3%. It's day 20. Welcome again to the age of Trumpflation. Donald Trump knows that he doesn't have real solutions to bringing costs down despite his campaign promises. So what is he doing? He's distracting and diverting the American people, or trying to, with issues that have nothing to do with bringing prices down. He's distracting and diverting with issues like changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, talking about changing the chairman of the board of the Kennedy Center, talking about building hotels in Gaza, talking about the Panama Canal, talking about annexing Canada. These are not the things Americans signed up for. No way. If there's one mandate Donald Trump had, it was to fight inflation on day one, like he promised to do. But he's not doing that. He's focused on everything else except what Americans want most. Meanwhile, Americans woke up this morning to bad news for their bank accounts. They woke up to a grim reality that Donald Trump is not going to keep his promise to lower costs. They woke up. Americans woke up to an era of Trumpflation, and unfortunately, this is only the beginning. On DOGE. We all agree, I've said it many times, that cutting waste in government and increasing efficiency is a good thing. But what DOGE is doing is something else entirely. DOGE is taking a meat axe and attacking vital programs indiscriminately. Of the programs that he cuts, some may be wasteful. Many clearly are not. Cut now, says DOGE, ask questions later. Meanwhile, of course, Trumpflation continues to get worse. If Donald Trump and DOGE want to focus on efficiency, they should do it as the Constitution maintains and the founders wisely prescribed, through Congress. The founders knew we needed debate, we needed sunlight, we needed transparency, so we can see what programs can be improved or changed and what should be maintained. Instead, DOGE is taking a meat axe and cutting vital programs that virtually no one outside of DOGE would call wasteful. Cut now, ask questions later. I was in Albany and Syracuse on Monday visiting community health centers. These centers throughout the country, CHCs as they are known, community health centers, are among the most effective and efficient users of government funding. And they rely on federal dollars to provide high-quality, affordable health care for working people, far cheaper than when people would show up at a hospital. They're particularly important in rural areas where people have no options. But many of these community health centers have had their funding cut temporarily, and too many are still unable to access funding. Some have even had to close. That means many working people suddenly have no option for high-quality, affordable health care near them. Is this DOGE's idea of cutting wasteful spending, taking among the most effective, efficient parts of the healthcare system that deliver costs to people that deliver healthcare to people who need help with lower cost? Cut it without asking a question, without examining what community health centers do? Meat axe. Meat axe, that's what they're doing. Or let's look at programs like PEPFAR in the AID program. Again, they want to cut the whole AID. But what about PEPFAR? Do people at DOGE even realize what PEPFAR does? It helps combat things like AIDS. It has saved 25 million lives. Other programs stop things like Ebola in Central Africa. If Ebola is left unchecked, it could one day spread to America, from Uganda to around the world today. There are flights from Kampala all over the world. So even if you oppose foreign aid on a policy ground, most people believe that PEPFAR and the programs fighting Ebola in Central Africa are effective and cost-effective and make us more secure. God forbid Ebola would spread to the United States. You want to see what government waste looks like? It doesn't look like those two programs. Thanks to DOGE, here's what government waste looks like that DOGE has created. Thanks to DOGE, $500 million in food assistance through USAID is sitting in ports and ships and warehouses unable to move. And so the bottom line is simple. If you want to make cuts, you have sunlight, transparency, debate in Congress, not lawlessness, not breaking the law because you feel, well, you know more than anybody else. Not by implementing cuts and asking questions later. It's a formula for disaster when you do things like that. These policies will hurt children, they'll hurt seniors, they'll hurt veterans, and so many other of our friends and neighbors. On reconciliation. Today, Senate Republicans' scheme to pass tax cuts for the ultra-rich takes the next important step. Later today, Chairman Graham of the Budget Committee will hold a markup of the Republicans' first reconciliation bill. Republicans claim that their bill will be fully paid for, but that means Republicans are laying the groundwork to gut things like nutrition assistance, funding for nursing homes, student debt support, and to kill clean energy jobs that employ Americans in red and blue states alike. There's been so much focus on how Republicans are going to pass their signature bills. Should it be one bill? Should it be two bills? At the end of the day, talking about process is a sideshow. This one bills, two bills, or 100 bills is meaningless. What they're trying to do is give tax cuts to the very wealthy, further tax cuts to the very wealthy, who are doing just fine. And they're hurting average Americans by cutting programs, again, meat acts, slashing across the board to do it. They could carve up their bill, they could carve up one bill, two bills, five bills, as I said, it doesn't matter. They could carve it up in their agenda however they want. They could change the order of policies they tackle first. But the end game does not change. This is all about clearing the path to cutting taxes for billionaires and making the American people foot the bill. The whole thing, the whole big enterprise is aimed with one goal in mind: tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, large tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, who, as I said, they're doing fine. Not as fine as the average American who just saw their inflation go up 3%. Plain and simple, again, what is their plan? Funnel more wealth to the ultra-wealthy while slashing everything else to the bone. Gutting Medicare and Medicaid, yanking school lunches from kids, blocking prescription drug reforms which make drugs cheaper for the average American, cutting funding for cancer research, one of the most popular things we do, cutting research for semiconductor manufacturing, letting China get ahead of us. No matter how they dress it up, no matter what spin they can put on it, Republicans' agenda boils down to this: tax cuts for the wealthy, deep, painful cuts for everybody else. And finally, on the nomination we're about to vote on in a little while, the Gabbard nomination. Every single Democrat, I am proud to say, will oppose the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard, because we simply cannot, in good conscience, trust our most classified secrets to someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for conspiracy theories. So before my Republican colleagues cast their vote to confirm Ms. Gabbard, I hope they're going to think carefully one last time, because America's safety, America's security is at stake. Is Ms. Gabbard really who Republicans want leading intelligence agencies? I'll bet not. Is she the best person we could find for the important position of Director of National Intelligence? Of all the people who know the intelligence world, I know some will be conservative like Donald Trump would want, but they wouldn't have the huge question marks about them that Ms. Gabbard has. Do Republicans truly believe, I say to my colleagues, that someone who has so carelessly and repeatedly echoed Russian propaganda and sympathized with the likes of Putin and Assad is the right person for this job? I ask my Republican colleagues to think about the safety of the American people and the concern of our allies and the threats posed by Vladimir Putin before casting this vote. Objectively, I think most senators would agree there are better choices to lead national intelligence. You know what my guess is? If we had a secret ballot, Gabbard might get 10 votes and 40 against her from the other side. People know. That's why they raise so many questions. But Donald Trump and Elon Musk evidently threatened them, and they're changing their view. The Director of National Intelligence must be strong against America's adversaries. This is an amazing one. How could we put someone in when you hear about this? After Assad used chemical weapons against his own people in 2017 and 2018, Tulsi Gabbard turned against U.S. intelligence. By the way, at that point, Donald Trump was president, and sided with fringe conspiracy theorists to cast doubt on these two specific incidents. I want to be clear about how strange and troubling this episode was. On one side, you had the entire U.S. intelligence ecosystem, the intelligence system of the French government, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, all saying the same thing, that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people in 2017 and 2018. The findings were not speculation. They were based on satellite imagery, witness accounts, medical experts. In other words, the kind of intelligence data that Ms. Gabbard would be responsible for evaluating if she, God forbid, gets this job. On the other side of all these experts and all this evidence, fact-based, you had Tulsi Gabbard relying on the judgment of an individual who had appeared on Russian-funded propaganda outlets, questioning those findings, shielding Assad for his inhumane conduct. I have to say, I have never heard of a DNI nominee who was so ready and willing to question the findings of America's own intelligence operations and yet accept Russian disinformation so easily. And of course, I'm troubled by her long record of showing weakness against Russia when it came to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. On the night Russia invaded Ukraine and launched the first full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation in Europe since World War II, what was Ms. Gabbard doing? She was on Twitter at 11:30 p.m. blaming NATO and the United States for starting the war in Ukraine when Putin invaded Ukraine. She said the war could have been avoided had NATO and the U.S. just accommodated Putin. That's who we want as head of national intelligence? By the way, Russian state TV gleefully aired these comments shortly thereafter. And now Republicans want to make this person the top U.S. intelligence chief. Can you believe it? I really don't believe my Republican colleagues believe she's the right choice. I really don't. I know the pressures that have been placed upon them. There's word in the newspapers and other places that people were told their elections would be opposed, etc. Who knows? But we do know that there was tremendous pressure on Republican senators. But sometimes, my Republican colleagues, you have to buck and stand up to the pressure and say, no, this is the wrong choice, definitely the wrong choice for America. And again, I'd repeat, if there were a secret ballot, I would bet that Gabbard would get no more than 10 votes in the Senate. 10. Maybe. So the nomination of Ms. Gabbard is one of those moments. So again, before Republicans cast their vote to confirm Ms. Gabbard today, please, please, please answer one simple question. Do you care more about doing the right thing for our national security or doing whatever is necessary to keep Donald Trump happy? I yield the floor.
What a piece of garbage. Je savais pas que Kennedy va être confirmé aussi ce matin. Ça fait dire que là, on va avoir Tulsi à. Quelle heure qu'il est là? Il est 11h. Quelle heure qu'il est? Il est 10h48. Dans 12 minutes, on va
Majority
la.
Whip.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I just heard the minority leader, the senior senator from New York, Senator Schumer, on this floor talking about today's consumer price index data. And stunningly, he points to President Trump as the reason for it. Now, let me just correct the record, Mr. President. The price data that Senator Schumer is complaining about is from the final days of the Joe Biden administration. Those are the numbers that are out today. The final days of the Biden administration. And certainly everyone in Wyoming and everyone in your home state in Oklahoma knows that under the Biden administration, the Democrats, prices of goods and groceries, gasoline, the things that we need in our everyday life, prices rose more than 20% under Joe Biden. High prices are Joe Biden's parting gift and his lasting legacy. They were the party of open borders and high prices. That's why they lost the election. So here we have the Senate minority leader, now in the minority, used to be in the majority. The reason he's in the minority is because of the high prices brought on the people of this country as a result of that administration, and the numbers out today are reflective of the final days of that administration. Painfully high prices. They came from Democrats' reckless overspending and their policies. And we're from energy states that was anti-American energy policies. Those are the things that Senate Democrats voted for repeatedly and stood behind and supported. Republicans are focused on making life more affordable for families all across this country, hardworking families. And we have a plan to unleash American energy. And that way, we can keep lowering prices for American families. I just can never forget when Joe Biden said he wanted to prioritize climate over energy that was available, affordable, and reliable. It was a disaster for the country and resulted in defeat of the Democrats. Today, Mr. President, I come to the floor also to talk about confirmation votes. And the Senate will soon vote on the confirmation of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. America needs to be healthy. I'm a doctor, worked with patients for over 20 years, as a surgeon in Wyoming. The problem is our nation faces a chronic disease epidemic. Chronic diseases, including diabetes, cancer, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, chronic diseases. They are so widespread that managing them accounts for almost 90% of the federal health care spending in this country. And we spend a lot of our gross national product on health care. Nearly 3 in 5 Americans, adults, and 1 in 4 American children are impacted by this. Our health care system tries to address the problem, but yet by incentivizing procedures over prevention and paying for that, well, it often fails to address what we need to do effectively as well as economically. As a result, Americans are actually becoming less healthy. We need to put America on the path to good health. President Trump has selected Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to do just that, to make America healthy again. Mr. Kennedy will bring a fresh set of ideas and eyes to important debates surrounding our nation's public health. He's going to be a voice for the vast number of Americans who were failed by the previous administration. The previous administration silenced reasoned debate. I believe that Mr. Kennedy is going to deliver accountability and transparency. For Americans, that means more choices and better information. It means healthy foods and healthy competition for patients. It means lower costs and higher quality. It means increased access to care. Access is so critical in my home state of Wyoming, with so many rural and frontier communities, people long distances from health care. It also means honest, unbiased, and trustworthy scientific research that is both innovative as well as accountable to the American people. People want the truth. They want to know what the facts are. They want to make their decisions then for themselves. Look, this is Mr. Kennedy's bold vision to revitalize America's Bill of Health. He's very clear about his mission, has been throughout. The mission, as he told the Finance Committee, is to end the chronic disease epidemic and make America healthy again. Apparently, that's not enough for the Senate Democrats. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, she was actually dismissive of him at the Senate Finance Committee. I heard her say to Mr. Kennedy, "So that's the only reason why you're at HHS, to address this one issue?" This one issue, chronic disease epidemic that is plaguing our nation, is the key issue to our health care. Respectfully, addressing chronic disease is what we ought to be talking about for health care for the people of our country. You know, Mr. Kennedy had to testify and did testify before two separate Senate committees as part of his confirmation. Most people being confirmed and coming to the Senate only testify at one committee. He responded to rigorous questions from both Republicans and Democrats, and he answered those questions with candor and with clarity. He told the Senate Help Committee that his leadership approach was collaborative. He pledged to empower the scientists to do their jobs, not to impose, as he said, preordained opinions on anybody at HHS. He was also clear that he supports vaccines. He told the Finance Committee, "I support the measles vaccine. I support the polio vaccine. I will do nothing as HHS Secretary," he said, "that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking those vaccines." The Senate has every reason to take him at his word. Mr. Kennedy is a bold choice. He is pro-health, pro-vaccine, and pro-transparency. He's the right choice to make America healthy again. I look forward to voting to confirm him. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Bon. Allô Annie, allô tout le monde. Hi everybody. Well, it seems that now they're going to prepare for vote.
President,
Oh, we listen.
Senator from
We
Virginia.
can listen.
I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for 6 minutes, followed by Senator Wyden for 5 minutes, Senator Crapo for 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 2 minutes prior to the scheduled vote.
They want to delay this thing for another half an hour. Please say no.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise once more to oppose the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the director.
I had enough of this bullshit now. Now they're going to talk for another half an hour. This is fucking hell. They're doing everything in their power. Well, I just had it, okay? So I don't want to cancel the stream, but I don't want to listen to them. So we're going to talk about something else. Okay, we're going to talk about what happened yesterday. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to mute this, and I'm going to put the press conference of yesterday. Actually, it's way more interesting than that, until they come back. Là, je sais ce que je vais faire. Je vais prendre la conférence de presse de Anna hier. Je vais la remettre pour le monde qui n'ont pas vu. De temps en temps, c'est caler ça des niaiseries. Attendez une seconde. Oh, je vais donner un autre écran. They're doing everything in their power to delay this. This is insanity on steroids. Ils font tout pour delay tout ça. OK? Bon. Pendant que les autres, ils vont faire leur fuckery, vous allez écouter ça. OK? Vous allez écouter ça. Pour ceux qui ne l'ont pas vu, vous allez écouter. Puis ceux qui l'ont vu, bien, vous allez le réécouter. Parce que c'est très important. For people that have listened to it again because it's very important. And people that have not seen it, well, then you'll see it. Much more important than the stupidity that they're saying. So listen to this, I'll be back. It's only 20 minutes. Not even that. 17 minutes. Listen. I'll be back. Listen to this now. I'll be back after 17 minutes.
Thank you all for being here. Today is a great day for transparency in America because today I'm proud to announce the creation of the Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets. This task force will be a part of the House Oversight Committee and led by the very talented and persistent Congresswoman from Florida, Anna Paulina Luna. During her time on the Oversight Committee, Representative Luna is a sledgehammer against government secrecy. She is committed to throwing open the windows for the American people to allow the sunlight of truth shine on the federal government. I can think of no better person in Congress to lead this task force than Representative Luna. Last month, President Trump signed an executive order to begin the process to declassify information on the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK. This task force serves to build on President Trump's actions. For far too long, the American people have had reasonable questions of what their government, which they fund every day, keeps hidden about certain issues. And for far too long, the federal government has not answered these questions. This creates distrust in our institutions. That ends today. The voters of this nation delivered a historic mandate to President Trump on November 5th. The keystone of that mandate was demanding increased transparency of their government and elected leaders, and the mandate of this task force is to acquire that transparency. We will open this up for questions from the media, but first I'd like to hand it over to my esteemed colleague and chairman of the new task force, Congresswoman Luna, for her remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Comer. When our founding fathers stood against tyranny, they did not merely oppose taxes. They defended the sacred idea of individual sovereignty. They declared that no government, agency, or title could infringe upon the freedoms of speech, religion, thought, and the pursuit of truth. For too long, the American spirit has been dimmed by a veil of secrecy, by a government that has grown too comfortable in the shadows, denying us the transparency we deserve. But today, we stand at the dawn of a new era where the light of truth begins to shine through. A few weeks ago, President Donald Trump made a historic announcement. With the stroke of a pen, he committed to declassifying the files concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a decision not just monumental, but pivotal. It is with profound honor that I have been entrusted by Speaker Mike Johnson and Chairman James Comer to lead the House Oversight Task Force on Declassification of Federal Secrets. Together with the help of the White House, our intelligence allies, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, we will be conducting investigations into the following: the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Dr. Martin Luther King, unidentified aerial phenomena, also known as UAPs, unidentified submerged objects, also known as USOs, the Epstein client list, the origins of COVID-19, and the 9/11 files. This task force will be a beacon of bipartisanship, On the Republican side, Representatives Burchett, Boebert, Burleson, Crane, Gill, and Mace will be joining me, although I'd like to note that I'm expanding this to the entire governing body and will be allowing certain members to waive on. Our first hearing is set for March. The date will be announced soon, and we've already initiated close to a dozen communications with various agencies, to include Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice and the Secretary of State. This will no longer be a task force that makes bold promises only to fade into irrelevance or send strongly worded letters. This will be a relentless pursuit of truth and transparency, and we will not stop until the American people have the answers they deserve. We will cut through the bureaucracy, challenge the stonewalling, and ensure that the American people finally get the truth that they have been denied for too long. If we are to endure and thrive as a nation, we must restore trust through transparency. The American people must be trusted to think for themselves, to form their own judgments from the truth that they are entitled to know. We've been treated like children for too long and kept in the dark by those we elected to serve us. It is my solemn duty to begin mending this trust, to form a new relationship between the government and the governed. Let us embark on this journey together towards a government that does not serve, but one that enlightens. That does not just serve, but one that enlightens. Trust through transparency, that begins now. Without further ado, we'd like to open it up for questions, as I'm sure many of you have those. Hands up.
Thank you, Mary. Obviously, your goals are aligned with the administration's on the declassification of Martin Luther King and the Kennedys. How would you handle if you end up, whether it's President Trump or Attorney General Bondi or DNI Gabbard, if they disagree with what you're looking to declassify on a certain topic, whether it's UAPs or 9/11 or something like that? How would you handle if there's some stuff that they don't necessarily want to declassify?
Well, certainly, I think that they'd be supportive, being that they're advocating for this, but also I want to remind the American people that this is bipartisan. There's also Democrats that are looking into answering these very questions, but certainly we would share that information with the American people. This is about transparency, and I think, again, as I stated, for far too long, there's been a massive push to keep the American people in the dark, and that ends today. Chairman?
The task force does not have subpoena power. I do. The task force is going to be subsidiary of the full oversight committee. So if we have to issue one, Congresswoman Luna, we'll discuss it and we'll take appropriate action.
But in full transparency, we have a great working relationship, as I stated earlier, with the White House, with the DOJ, with the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State. The incoming FBI director, I think, will be very supportive, and we've also been told that the CIA director is very supportive. To put it in perspective, I think that this issue transcends not just one administration, but multiple administrations, and it hasn't been until now that we've been able to get people actually in positions of power that will push for transparency. Now, if I find that different entities in the various intelligence agencies are stonewalling us, I'm going to make that known to the American people. But as of right now, we are cautiously optimistic.
What's your priority list? Because Epstein, 9/11?
Our first investigation will be announced, but it's going to be covering on a thorough investigation into the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I can tell you, based on what I've been seeing so far, the initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress was actually faulty in the single bullet theory. I believe that there were two shooters, and we should be finding more information as we are able to gain access into the SCIF, hopefully before the files are actually released to the public.
Thank you for doing this. Have you identified the Democrats who will sit on the task force, and could you talk a little bit more about the role of Democrats in this?
Yeah, so again, this is a bipartisan commission. Remember, JFK was a Democrat, RFK was a Democrat, and I'm sure that I think the entire conference has a question on what actually happened with Dr. Martin Luther King, but also UAPs. You guys know that that was the biggest bipartisan bicameral hearing that we've ever had, I think, in congressional history. I do not know who their members are yet. They've noticed it, but they're taking this very seriously. This is not a conspiracy theory investigating committee. We're actually looking to present truth to the American people, and it's in my opinion that no one person elected to office is more important or more qualified to look at the information that they've been hiding from us. And so we look to push for that transparency.
What sort of witnesses will you expect to have at your hearings? I know you said the first one's in March. Would that be department heads, former employees of various agencies?
would you like to jump in? Yeah, I was going to say, based on what we're actually looking to do with the JFK investigation, I'm looking to actually bring in some of the attending physicians at the initial assassination, and then also people that had been on the various commissions looking into, like the Warren Commission looking into the initial assassinations. There's been conflicting evidence, and I think that even the FBI at the time reported some anomalies in the initial autopsy at Bethesda, Maryland. All of those, though, seem to have been rinsed and repeated in the media to push a certain narrative that we don't agree with. And so I think that in order to put to bed some of the theories that have been out there on John F. Kennedy, we have to know the full truth, and the full truth starts with transparency, and that's why these files is so important for the American people to read for themselves.
With this task force, what are you hoping to uncover as far as UAPs that you have not already heard from other UAP hearings?
The biggest information problems that we've had with UAPs is the amount of stonewalling, stovepiping, and also it seems that there is this push to gaslight the American people into looking at the evidence and then not fully believing it. I think for us, if we're writing the budget, for example, into the Pentagon, if we're writing the budget overall for whatever programs might be out there, why is it that members of Congress who are given a top secret security clearance are being denied access? That's not a free and true government. And so for us, especially being that we have now a Secretary of State who's actually open to declassification and Marco Rubio, we're hoping to present that information and at least acknowledge it from a government perspective that we are not alone, but also let's see what the evidence is.
Thank you. Have you already been in contact with or started to send requests to these different agencies and federal departments for this information?
Yes, in fact, the letters went out this morning, not just on RFK, JFK, and MLK, but on everything that I had listed above to include UAPs, Epstein, and 9/11 and COVID, to the State Department, Department of Defense, CIA, and then also we'll be sending some to the FBI, and letters have also gone out to the NSA.
How is this going to be different than the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which did investigate both the John F. Kennedy assassination and the King assassination?
Well, what's interesting on that specific committee is what, to my understanding, when they actually brought in expert witnesses, they weren't actually people that were in attendance to the initial autopsy at Bethesda, but also this is a bigger committee than just the JFK assassinations. We're also expanding into Epstein, COVID origins, 9/11s, and then UAPs and USOs. And so before, where we initially had some of these hearings, this is going to be an encompassing committee that's going to work directly with the White House on information that they're declassifying. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Correct. Correct. There's actually 3 different government investigations into the JFK assassination. But again, this committee is expanding not just there, but outwards into other fields. And again, we're working directly with the White House. In previous investigations, they didn't have access to the information that we are going to have access to. And so that's a big deal, especially if you're looking at what truly happened with JFK.
Are you going to get a top secret clearance?
I already have a top secret clearance.
You do?
All members of Congress have a TSCI. The question is do we get SAP access, of which Chairman Comer has been very supportive, and we'll be getting SAP access as well. Okay, 2 more, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Obviously, some of the questions on some of these topics, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or COVID-19, the questions are obvious. What specifically, though, are the questions you're looking to get answered with regards to September 11th?
We just want the truth. How much did the CIA know in advance? But also, remember, when you have only certain information that's shared with the American people, that's when conspiracy theories happen. And it's in my opinion that conspiracy theories can be detrimental. It doesn't mean that in the last couple of months we haven't been right on a few things, but what I will say is I think that we deserve to give this information to the American people. I don't agree with the stonewalling that's occurred. And also, how do we prevent things like it from happening in the future? And we have to know the full picture, and the American people deserve to know that as well.
Any collaboration with the Department of Government Efficiency?
I don't know what information DOJ would have, but I would encourage them if they have anything on JFK, Epstein, or anything in between that they bring it to our office immediately. Okay, 1 more and then we'll wrap it up. Of course.
Well, we have a lot of questions. Some of the people in the mayor's administration have been vocal that they weren't going to comply with federal law that they were going to continue to act as sanctuary cities. We want to know about coordination and communication they had between the previous administration. How did so many of these illegals get there? Who was paying for it? Who were they communicating with to be able to provide housing and so many other benefits to such a large population of people? Just the basic questions we all have. Who was paying for it? Who was leading the efforts to transport the illegals from wherever their entry point was in the United States to these sanctuary cities? And are the mayors going to comply with federal law now? Are they going to work with Tom Homan and the national security groups in the Trump administration to try to deport the criminal illegals and stop being a sanctuary city?
Do you feel less worried about Eric Adams himself, considering his signals?
Worried about what?
Do we feel less worried about Eric Adams?
Eric Adams, I mean, he was one of the first mayors to bring up the crisis situation, the fiscal impact on the city. So I think he would be a very good witness, and we have a lot of questions for him, just like we do the other three mayors. So,
All right, one last question, then we're going to wrap it up. News Nation, let's go.
Can I ask about your relationship with whistleblowers? Is it going to be the normal process that oversight typically does, or would this be? Are you going to create a separate avenue for the task force?
I mean, we're all about the normal process, but look, if you have information and it's credible, we've always approached it in that I'd like to be the person that does the interviews for it, mainly because, especially with stuff like this, we want to make sure that there's, not bad actors that are pushing false information to create a narrative that's simply not there. And so, every whistleblower that does come forward, as of right now, there's people that have been publicly out there, for example, on the JFK stuff, that were actually present in the room at the operating room where he was actually brought to right after the shooting. So we hope to bring those people in to testify. And again, these hearings will be open to the public. I'm also expanding this to the entire conference. So if someone's going to take this seriously and look at it through an investigative lens and get answers for the American people, they are welcome to ask questions of the witnesses, and you guys will all receive notice of that.
And we'll work with anyone who currently works with the federal government that wants to declare whistleblower status and receive whistleblower protection, if that's what they're interested in doing. And I don't think they're going to face the type of retaliation that the previous administration gave whistleblowers, particularly the IRS whistleblowers that blew the whistle on the cover-up of the Biden family.
And I'd also like to close with this. If you are an independent investigator, we are being told that the FBI has now located thousands of pages of documents that they lost before, specifically relating to JFK. We are going to get through as much as we can. We have a great team of attorneys. We have a great team of investigators looking into this. But it doesn't mean that we won't accept help from the public. And so we will be setting up a place for collection for people to present information. But again, this is about transparency. The government works for us. There have been people, I think, in power for too long that try to silo us and keep us in the dark, but that stops today. You're seeing that same message come out of the White House, out of the CIA, the FBI, and every other agency in between. So we are very happy to have the support of all of those individuals, happy to have the support of Chairman Comer and Speaker Johnson. And if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Oversight Comms, and we'd be happy to answer those at that time. Thank you, guys.
Bon, so now they're going to vote. Bonjour tout le monde. Bon, là ils vont voter. Unofficial tally in 14 minutes. I don't exactly know how it works, but we'll wait. I've been waiting. Here.
Blumenthal.
Yeah, they are doing the tally now. Listen.
Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker.
Okay, listen to that.
Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Brett. Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins,
Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lamas, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Grassley, Johnson, Justice, Lankford, Moran, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Tillis, Tuberville. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Coons, Hassan, Heinrich, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Murray, Peters, Schumer, Shaheen, Van Hollen, Wyden. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Gallego, no.
This thing is taking forever. Bonjour tout le monde. Bon, ça prend.
Mr. Thune,
Euh,
Mr. Thune, aye.
Bon. On va continuer à écouter ça, là. Ça va finir bientôt, là. Je vois pas grand monde. Puis,
Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Welch, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Slotkin, no. Mrs. Capito, Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
This thing is taking forever to drive me up the fucking wall. We only need 6 votes now. I know she's going to be confirmed, but I just want to finish this so we can move on with other things. Bonjour tout le monde. Ouais, ça prend une éternité, cette patente-là. Là. Je sais pas c'est quoi. C'était supposé être à 11h. Là, c'était retardé. Là, ça prend une éternité. Là, il y a 6 votes. Aussitôt que ça arrive à 51, là, c'est fini. Là. Elle est confirmée, puis let's move on. Puis après,
Mr. Booker, no.
on écoute, qu'est-ce qu'ils disent. Ils n'ont pas les votes, anyway. Fait que, je veux juste voir ça, là. C'est vraiment important. Je reviens. Thank you for being here. I'll be right back. Je reviens, ok? Écoutez ça, là, je reviens.
Mr. Kane, no. Miss Rosen, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye.
Bon, c'est quasiment fini, là. Il reste 2 votes, là. On a besoin de 2 votes ici, là, dernier, puis c'est fini, là, la patente, là.
Mr. Padilla, no.
C'est des esti ça, les démocrates, en tout cas. C'est j'ai à dire.
Mr. Young, aye.
Bon, là, on est 50. On a besoin d'un autre vote, puis c'est fini, là.
Ms. Markowski, aye.
Bon, c'est fini. Confirmé. It's done. She's been confirmed. Great news. She's being confirmed. That's great news. I want to see the total of everything. Let's see. Je vais avoir le tally, moi, de toute la patente. This is great news. Very great news. C'est des bonnes nouvelles à confirmer pour aller forward avec autre chose. C'est vraiment une bonne nouvelle. Confirmé.
Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett. No.
Il reste 5 votes, ils sont 100. Donc ça va être 49-51. De façon que je vois ça, là. Il va finir ça, là, lui, là. Pour qu'est-ce qu'attendre, tu sais coller ça, là. C'est pas efficient, ça. Pour qu'il y manque dans l'histoire, là.
Mr. Hawley. Aye.
Oh, look at that. It's done. Ok, là, ils vont faire le tally. Oh, this is great news. I think there's a Democrat that voted for Tulsi. Pas sûr, là, mais je pense qu'il y a un démocrate qui a voté pour Tulsi. Je vais voir le tally. I want to see. They're gonna see. Il y a sa feuille, lui, là. Il va prendre avec sa feuille.
OK.
Il dit la conversation. Il va
Yeas are 52, nays are 48. Nomination is confirmed.
Oh.
Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately notify of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President, I
Majority Leader.
move to waive the mandatory quorum with respect to the Kennedy nomination.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion and invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. A quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks,
Oh,
Mr.
ils vont voter
Barrasso.
pour Kennedy, là. Alors, là, ils vont voter pour Kennedy, si boire. Bon, une vote clôture, une mesure de Kennedy, ça veut dire qu'ils vont arrêter ils ont plus de débat. Là, ils votent pour Kennedy, là. Bon, Chris, je pensais finir ça, là, mais non, ils votent pour Kennedy. Ben, tant qu'à être ici, on va les faire, les deux. Là, ils vont voter pour Kennedy. Ouais, c'est long, c'est très long, Anne. Annie, c'est pas supposé être si long que ça, habituellement, là, mais là, c'est long. C'est ce que je te dis. It's not supposed to be that long usually, but it's long. Fait que Tulsi a été confirmé. Et là, ils font Robert Kennedy. Bon. Au moins, on a une de faite. C'est les deux plus importants qui restent, là. Je vois pas d'autres qui restent. Ah, je pense qu'il reste Patel. Pas sûr. I think we have Patel left. I'm not very sure. I think we have Patel left. Not very sure. Louis, on va faire son roll call, là. On va laisser ça René, là. Je sais que Kennedy est bien aimé par beaucoup de monde. Il va faire beaucoup de bien pour la santé.
Mr. Bennett.
J'en reviens.
Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Thank you. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Ono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. I did not, thank you. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane.
No, yes.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thanks. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Capito, Kramer, Curtis, Fisher, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, McConnell, McCormick, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, and Tuberville. Ms. Collins, aye. Senators voting in the negative: thank you. Also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Coons, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Lujan, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Shaheen, Slotkin, and Smith. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Warren, no.
Ouais, Annie, c'est tout un dog and pony show, là, qu'on passe au travers. Qu'est-ce que tu veux que je te dise? Il n'y a pas de choix, là, c'est ça. Là, ils vont faire la clôture, puis après la clôture, ben, ils vont faire le vote pour lui, je pense, là, c'est ça. C'est la première fois que je vois une clôture, là, mais on va checker ça, là. Qu'est-ce que tu veux que je te dise?
Mrs. Britt, aye.
C'est long, mais c'est ça.
Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Thank you. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla, no.
Ouais,
Klobuchar,
c'est que là,
no.
là ils vont finir ça, là. Puis d'après moi, si le clôture, il fonctionne, ils vont faire le vote pour Kennedy. C'est le même. Pour moi, d'après moi, c'est le même où ça va aller. So I think that after this,
Gillibrand, no.
they're going to confirm him, or else they're gonna keep debating him. That's what I think. Bon, là, si ça c'est arrivé, si ça passe la clôture, ben, ils ont fini le debate, puis ils vont probablement voter. C'est ça que moi je pense qui va arriver. Mais là, il n'y a personne là, dans la chose. Là. Je sais pas ce qui va arriver après ça. Là. On va voir. On va voir.
Mr. Risch, aye. Mr.
Okay.
Schmidt, aye.
49. Ça peut finir, là. Ben, c'est pour ça qu'il y a du monde qui veut voir ça. C'est pour ça que je fais le live stream de ça, mais je suis curieux, on va dire. Ah, bon. Je reviens de ça, mais il est en train de prendre son bain, je reviens.
Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye.
Bon, la clôture va arriver parce qu'ils ont 51 votes. Ça veut dire que là, ça va finir. Puis là, je sais pas s'ils vont voter encore ou pas. That's the thing I don't know. Ils vont me dire, là. Alors, c'est confirmé. La clôture va arriver. La question est, qu'est-ce qui arrive après ça? So, it's been confirmed. The clôture has arrived. And question is, what's going on after that? Non, non, c'est pas la confirmation, c'est juste la clôture. Hey, Amstead, non, c'est juste la clôture. Non, Tulsi a été confirmé, pas lui. Ça, c'est la clôture, c'est pas la nomination. Ah, ça, c'est Kennedy. C'est un autre Kennedy, ça. Fait que là, ils vont dire quelque chose. Là. Fait qu'ils vont parler, on va savoir quelque chose. Wow. J'attends de voir qu'est-ce qu'il va dire. Pour moi, il n'y aura pas un vote tout de suite parce qu'il n'y a personne dans la salle. Là. Ils vont peut-être faire le vote demain ou plus tard, aujourd'hui, je sais pas. Parce qu'ils travaillent pas vite, eux autres, laisse-moi dire. So I don't know if they're gonna have a vote or not after that, but they're not working fast, I wish I can tell you. On va attendre.
Ms. Lummis, aye.
Il reste un vote, là. Je sais pas c'est qui niaise avec la POC, là. Il reste un vote. I don't know who the fuck is fucking around, but there's one vote missing in this whole thing.
Mr. Young, aye.
Bon, mais tabarnak, là, c'est fini. Oh! Il y a quelqu'un, un démocrate qui a voté pour le 53-47, là. Bon, envoyez, là, si vous alignez avec vos fêtes. Bon, là, c'est fini, là. On va avoir la clôture. Bon, ce que je veux savoir, c'est qu'est-ce qui va arriver après, là. So now we got the clôture. And what does that mean? I have no idea. Okay, let me check here.
Ms. Hirono, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California, to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon, sorry.
Mr. President, as we begin this discussion that is so important to America, I thought I would just mention the conversation I had recently with a couple of young medical students who came up to me and said, you know, we know you're interested in health care and have been involved in this, and I'm so appreciative of Senator Murray, who's going to
Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California, to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon, sorry.
Mr. President, as we begin this discussion that is so important. The way we see this Kennedy nomination, it's not just a vote for next week or even next year. This is a vote with enormous impact for decades, because Mr. Kennedy, according to these young students, these young medical students, has a long record of essentially being anti-science. And I thought these medical students.
Là, je sais qu'ils vont parler pendant 1 heure de temps encore, là. On va fermer tout ça. Bon, là, on va recaper tout ça, là. Tulsi a été confirmé. Tulsi is confirmed as the Director of National Intelligence. So that's a confirmation. Là, je sais pas qu'est-ce qu'il fait, lui, là. Il parle. Puis, je sais pas. Well,
as the Senate has just voted to advance the nomination of RFK Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary, they are now going to go into the discussion portion ahead of the vote itself. We're going to step away for a 2-minute break here on Live Now from Fox, continuing this breaking news. And we also have more breaking news to let you know about after the break involving President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's coming up in 2 minutes.
Bon, on va attendre qu'elle revienne, là, elle, pour que je sache que c'est quoi qu'elle veut dire, là. Chic Donald, je vais voir qu'est-ce qu'elle va dire, mais Chic Donald, il y a eu un échange de hostage avec Vlad un matin, ou hier au soir. I know that there was a hostage, quelle heure qui est, là? I have a call I'm expecting at 1 o'clock to fix one of my problems here. I won't be able to be live much longer. Là, je peux pas rester live longtemps parce que j'ai un téléphone que j'attends à 1 heure pour réparer un problème ici. Là, j'essaie juste de voir. Lui, il va parler, là, puis ils vont tous parler, mais j'essaie juste de voir si elle sait quand qu'on va avoir le vote. Le fait que c'était 53-47 pour la clôture, c'est un bon signe qu'ils veulent avancer tout ça, là. Et nous, il peut juste delay, il peut pas arrêter ça parce qu'il y a 51 républicains. Puis fait que, on va voir. Le fait que le vote était comme ça pour la clôture, c'est un bon signe pour le Canada. On va voir. Au moins, Tulsi est confirmé, là. Au moins, on sait ça, là. Bon, là, je vais écouter ce qu'ils disent, là. On va écouter ce qu'ils disent, après, je vais checker tout ça. Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire avec ça, là. So, we're gonna listen to what they say when they come back, and then I'll see what I'm going to do about this. Mais je pense que le boss, c'est bien plus tard aujourd'hui, là. Je sais pas pour tout de suite, là. Il parle encore. Il n'y a pas un chat dans la chose. Là. Je vais juste voir qu'est-ce qu'il a dit là. Bon, on écoute.
Breaking news out of the White House as you take a live look of the White House itself on this snowy Wednesday afternoon as President Trump has just gotten off the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin, now inviting him to the United States. And I wanted to share some social media posts that President Trump just shared on Truth Social, and that is this right here. President Trump saying, quote, I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we likewise lost so many. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia and Ukraine. Going on to say this, quote, President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. We both believe very strongly in it. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We have also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something I will be doing right now. I have asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. Millions of people have died in a war that would not have happened if I were president, but it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call and for the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. Another live look right here of the White House as President Trump met with Mark Fogel yesterday, an American history teacher who was deemed wrongfully detained by Russia. He was released.
Well, this is actually breaking news. That means that Vlad and Donald are speaking, which is great news. C'est-à-dire que Vlad et Donald, ils se parlent. Ça, c'est des très bonnes nouvelles. Je vais voir si Artie n'en parle. Laisse-moi regarder ça, là. Oui, il en parle. Il parle, il dit exactement ce que j'ai entendu dire. Bon, ben ça, c'est des bonnes nouvelles. Bon, on s'en va vers le mieux, tout le monde. On s'en va vers le mieux. We're getting better. Things are getting better. Bon, fait que là, si c'est tout positif, là, je vais fermer le live, là, parce que j'attends un téléphone. Fait que on va fermer ça. On va voir s'il y a quelque chose d'autre qui arrive plus tard. Je reviendrai. Assurez-vous d'être sur Rumble, TikTok, puis Twitter, ok? Bon, je reviens plus tard. Putin invited, ça a l'air que Vlad a invité Donald à venir. Ah, ça serait toute une histoire. Si Donald irait voir Vlad. Ah! Ça va être historical. J'ai hâte de voir comment ça va se développer. Fait que je reviens plus tard avec d'autres nouvelles. Ici ou sur Rumble. Fait que checkez les deux. So I'll come back later, either here or on Rumble. So we talk later, okay? Thank you for joining. Bye, Annie. Bye, Amstead.